Sargon has stuck his head into our domain again and asked, why do blacks commit more crime? And he has answered this with a 100% environmental explanation. I am not strawmanning him. At the end of his video, he says he believes that the disparities in crime are adequately explained by the environmental disparities, primarily disparities in childhood environment, which he talks about in his video. Credit where it's due, Sargon does reference the correlation between arrests and the National Crime Victimization Survey, demonstrating that the claims of racial bias or over-policing are completely false. That in fact, victims of crime report the same kinds of racial proportions of offenders that are found in arrests. The data Sargon uses for racial disparities in crime commission all come from the United States. If one is naive, one might be confused as to why he didn't compare those with the racial disparities in crime commission in the United Kingdom. The similarities between proportions of criminal behavior between the US and the UK are quite tight. In the US, blacks are twice as likely to be arrested. In the UK, they are 4 times as likely. Blacks are 3 times as likely to commit burglary in the United States, and again, 3 times as likely to commit burglary in the UK. For robbery, the numbers in the US are a 400% rate of commission by blacks and a 1,200% rate of commission in the UK. Similar trends are found all over the world. And one might ask, why is this? Why is this such a consistent result, very often not only in the same direction, but to the same degree? And if your answer is because the environmental factors Sargon talks about are the same in all these various places, that doesn't answer the question. For why would it be, if it is even the case, that there are similar levels of poverty and single-parent households and disparities between the same races in different places? It is not as if there is an identical history or an identical population between these places. The black population of the United States are primarily descendants of former slaves, families who have lived in the United States for many generations. The black population in the UK are primarily the descendants of immigrants, families which have lived in the UK for a shorter period of time. And yet a similar tale is told when one looks at the criminal behavior. Let's discuss this idea of the intergenerational chain of poverty. It is question-begging to claim this as demonstration of an environmental cause. If being shitty at making money and being a violent thug are expressions of biological traits, the same intergenerational trend would occur even if living in poverty had zero effect, even if being brought up by a criminal had zero effect. And by the way, no one claims that. The only people who proclaim 100% causation in either the biological or environmental direction are those arguing for the environmental direction. No one claims that environment has no impact on such things as criminality, intelligence, money-making ability, social skills, or anything else. As evidence for the effect of poverty on future criminal activity, Sargon uses a mostly white population. And good on him for using that to avoid confounding variables such as race. But it doesn't quite work to the purpose when that is all you use. Comparisons between the races must also be shown. Secondly, good on Sargon for using data that talks about the history of the individual rather than his current economic state. When you look at comparisons of present wealth and present criminal activity, the racial gap shrinks quite a bit. Of course, being a criminal very often leads to poverty. So it is preferable to control for the effects of criminality on poverty by looking at history. I guess Sargon just didn't have the time to look up the actual relevant comparisons, but I have some right here. A study looking at the wealth of individuals and then tracking them for the next decade or so and seeing how likely they are to go to prison. Now, for the plebes out there who are going to read this article and say, oh, but the article itself says that this is the result of discrimination. Please learn the difference between empirical fact and spin. we've already covered the racial discrimination angle. Compare arrest rates to the proportions found by the victims of crime themselves. They match up quite well. Racial discrimination is empirically verified as not a systematic issue that actually impacts arrest or imprisonment statistics. So, between blacks, quote, Hispanics, and whites, for every wealth decile, except for the very top, that is the very top 10% income bracket, whites in every of those deciles commit less crime than blacks in any of those deciles, save the very top decile. That is to say, the poorest whites, or even the most criminal economic class of whites, which is in the third economic decile, are less criminal than blacks in any single bracket, as well as the entirety of the brackets, from 0 to 90%. Just as the National Crime Victimization Survey blows apart the racist cop or racist courts narrative, so this data blows apart the myth of the racial disparity in criminality being caused by poverty. Veering from the typical parole feed NPR to the typical parole feed Rush Limbaugh, Sargon goes into his second explanation. The old Sowellian chestnut of single-parent households cause crime. Now, it is true that children of single-parent households are imprisoned at a higher rate than children of full-parent households. However, does this adequately explain, as Sargon claims, the disparity in crime between the races? Absolutely not. In a study looking for variables correlated with homicide by Kenneth C. Land, Patricia L. McCall, and Lawrence E. Cohen, with the variables measured against homicide being population size, population density, percentage of the population that is black, the percentage of the population that is between the ages of 15 and 29, the percentage of men who are divorced, and the percentage of children without both parents, they identify only 2 of these as having consistently significant correlations. And those 2, neither of them are single-parent households. One is the percentage of men who are divorced, and the other is, you guessed it, the percentage of the population that is black. Race is a better predictor for homicide than single-parent households are. At the end of the video, Sargon lapses back into an aside about racist police and police brutality and discrimination by police. Another complete myth. Of course, there is police brutality. Is there any evidence that it is racially discriminatory? Absolutely none. Let's look at the racial numbers of fatal police shootings. 30% of those killed by the police in America are black. Meanwhile, however, 40% of cop killers are black, and 39% of violent criminals are black. There is, in fact, if anything, an anti-white bias in the commission of police handling of suspects. This is, in fact, backed up by training simulations in which it is found that policemen hesitate to shoot a simulated black suspect nearly 50% longer than they hesitate to shoot a simulated white suspect. This is, of course, exactly what should be expected in a culture where the myth of the white racist cop has been fully ingrained in the national consciousness since 1992, and when the government at all levels promotes anti-white racial bias and constantly claims falsely victimization of blacks by a racist system. Once again, we see Sargon conveniently only using data that backs up his case, data which he has to know does not tell the full story. There is no reason to make your entire case for the racial disparity with a population that does not have racial diversity. He knows what he is doing. He is a liar. Remember, this is the man who says, follow Saul Alinsky and his book, Rules for Radicals. A book in which Saul Alinsky says, when arguing for your political position, say anything that works, anything that will grab attention, anything that will tug at the heartstrings, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. The datasets used by Sargon to make his case do not make sense. He does not control for race when it is proper to do so. He does not control across race for the factors he claims are causal when it is proper to do so.